Manila pulsated under the stifling July heat as the famous Filipino boxer stepped out of his armored Mercedes in a simple neighborhood of General Santos City. Manny observed the streets of his hometown with nostalgia, remembering the difficult days when he wandered those same cracked sidewalks, dreaming of a better future. Now, decades later, he returned as a national hero, an icon of world boxing and an influential politician, but his heart still beat with the same rhythm of humility that raised him. The air carried the characteristic smell of fried fish and sea, as Manny walked unpretentiously toward his old primary school, Cayamba Central Elementary School. Dressed in simple clothes, jeans, a white t-shirt, and a discreet cap that partially hid his world-famous face, he wanted to revisit the place that held his earliest memories of education, before poverty forced him to abandon his studies to help support his family. His security guards remained at a respectful distance, allowing the champion to experience this moment of introspection. It was a Saturday morning, and the school was practically empty, except for a few staff members who were performing weekly maintenance. Manny felt his heart tighten as he saw the small concrete building, painted a faded blue, with windows protected by simple bars and a modest courtyard where children, just like him once, ran during breaks. The visit had not been announced, part of a personal journey of reconnection with his roots. At 45, after achieving everything an athlete could dream of, Manny felt a growing need to look back, to better understand the path he had traveled and, perhaps, rediscover something that had been left behind in the dizzying speed of his ascent. The rusty gate creaked when he pushed it, entering that territory that seemed simultaneously familiar and strange. As he crossed the silent courtyard, his eyes caught a solitary movement at the back of the school. It was an elderly man, bent over a large garbage bag, meticulously collecting papers and debris scattered by the wind. His wrinkled hands worked with dedication, while the merciless sun punished his shoulders curved by the weight of years. There was something about that solitary figure that immediately captured Manny's attention, a silent dignity that made him slow his steps. The elderly man didn't notice the famous visitor's presence, continuing his methodical work under the scorching sun. Manny watched, intrigued, as those wrinkled hands carefully separated recyclable materials, placing them in different bags. There was an almost ritualistic dedication in those movements, as if each piece of paper or plastic had a particular meaning. The man, who appeared to be over 70, wore a faded blue uniform with Cayamba Elementary embroidered on the pocket, and his arched back told stories of decades of physical work. Approaching slowly, Manny felt a strange tingling at the nape of his neck, a sensation of familiarity he couldn't explain. The janitor, concentrated on his task, was now collecting some damaged books that had been discarded near the trash bins. With almost reverential care, the man leafed through each book before deciding its fate, as if assessing whether it could still serve some educational purpose. It was a gesture that spoke of respect for knowledge, even in its most deteriorated form. When he was only a few meters away, Manny froze. A flash of recognition crossed his mind like lightning in a clear sky. The profile of that man, the way he slightly tilted his head when examining something, the peculiar way he walked dragging his left foot slightly. These were details buried in his childhood memories. Uncle Ernesto, the janitor who often gave pencils and paper to the poorest students, who fixed torn shoes during breaks, who sometimes kept an extra sandwich for children who arrived without lunch. Manny's heart raced as fragments of memory resurfaced like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle. He remembered a particularly difficult day when he had arrived at school hungry, without school supplies, after a night when his family had nothing for dinner. It was this same man, then with black hair and an upright posture, who had silently placed a package with pencils, notebook, and a banana bread on his desk, without making a fuss, without expecting thanks, just with a brief nod that said everything words could not express. Manny took a deep breath, feeling a wave of emotion he hadn't experienced for years in the ring. That humble man, now aged by time, had been a silent but fundamental presence in his childhood. Uncle Ernesto had never been officially his teacher, but had taught lessons that no formal curriculum could contain. about dignity, discreet generosity, and the nobility of honest work. And now, decades later, he continued there, taking care of the same space, collecting trash under the same unforgiving sun, with the same unwavering dedication. The past invaded the present with the force of an uppercut, bringing to the surface memories that Manny had kept in the most distant corners of his mind. He recalled the days when he observed Uncle Ernesto working around the school, always before dawn and long after the last bell. The janitor not only cleaned but repaired broken desks, painted peeling walls, and even planted colorful flowers to brighten the school environment. He was a man who transformed his function into a mission, treating that modest school as if it were a palace that deserved the most dedicated care. Manny remembered how, on days of heavy rain, when leaks made some classrooms unusable, Uncle Ernesto reorganized the spaces with extraordinary efficiency, ensuring that no class was lost. At school festivals, it was he who assembled the improvised stages where students presented their traditional Filipino dances and songs. And when children got hurt during play, it was often he, not the frequently absent nurse, who cleaned wounds and applied bandages with paternal gentleness. But the most vivid memory, the one that now made Manny's eyes water, was of a critical moment in his life. At 12, Manny was about to definitely abandon school, as his family could no longer sustain even the minimal expenses with education. On the morning he arrived to inform the principal of his departure, he had found Uncle Ernesto in the hallway. The janitor, noticing the sadness on the boy's face, had invited him to help fix a broken faucet. During that simple task, without grand speeches or explicit advice, the man had transmitted a silent message about perseverance and dignity that would stay with Manny forever. That same day, Uncle Ernesto had surprised everyone by speaking with the principal about a special program for working students, allowing Manny to continue for a few more months, with adapted schedules. Manny never knew exactly what the janitor had said or done, but those additional months had been crucial for the development of his basic reading and math skills. When he finally left school to work full-time, he had taken with him not only formal knowledge, but also the living lesson of integrity that he had observed daily in that tireless worker. Now, looking at the elderly man who continued his work under the unforgiving sun, Manny understood that part of who he had become was due to that silent influence. In his most difficult fights, when his body asked to give up, the unwavering determination he had seen in Uncle Ernesto had often served as unconscious inspiration. The iron discipline that had surprised trainers around the world had roots in those mornings when he observed the janitor arrive before everyone else, regardless of storms or illnesses, to ensure that everything was perfect for the school day. Manny approached slowly, his heart beating with the same intensity as the moments before entering the ring. Uncle Ernesto, now focused on fixing a broken broom with pieces of wire and adhesive tape, still hadn't noticed his presence. The elderly man's hands, marked by decades of physical work, moved with the precision of a craftsman, transforming what would be trash into a useful tool again. It was a living metaphor of what he had always done, creating value where others saw only discards. The Filipino sun illuminated the scene with its merciless golden light, creating an almost ethereal aura around the solitary figure of the janitor. Sweat ran down the man's wrinkled forehead, but his face maintained an expression of concentrated serenity. There was dignity in every movement, each precise gesture revealing a man who had found meaning in consistency and silent dedication. Manny remained motionless for a few moments, absorbing that living lesson about humility and purpose. When he finally decided to announce himself, Manny softly cleared his throat. The elderly man raised his eyes, initially with the neutral expression of someone who is used to going unnoticed. His eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, adjusted to the backlight before focusing on the visitor. For an instant, there was no recognition, just the automatic courtesy of a staff member before an unknown visitor. Then, like a slow wave that gradually grows, understanding began to transform his features. Uncle Ernesto's tired eyes widened slightly, his gray eyebrows rose, and his lips parted in silent amazement. It wasn't just the recognition of a national celebrity. It was the much deeper recognition of a child he had known decades ago, now transformed into a world-famous man. His expression transitioned from surprise to pride, as if contemplating a personal miracle of which he had been a small but significant part. Without fanfare, without exclamations, just with the silent dignity that had always characterized him, the elderly man slowly rose, ignoring the protest of his aged joints. There they stood, separated by only a few meters and by decades of distinct experiences. A man who had conquered global fame and fortune, and another who had remained faithfully in the same place, fulfilling the same duty with the same dedication. There was a dramatic contrast in their appearances and trajectories, but also a deep connection that transcended these superficial differences. The silence between them was charged with contained emotion, unverbalized stories, mutual recognition that went beyond language. In that moment suspended in time, they were not the world champion and the elderly janitor. They were just two Filipino men united by fragments of shared past. Uncle Ernesto's expression revealed decades of untold stories. His eyes, blurred by age but still shrewd, observed Manny with a mixture of admiration and nostalgia. It was evident that he had followed the meteoric trajectory of the former student through newspapers, television, and neighborhood conversations. The janitor made a discreet movement to adjust his uniform, an instinctive gesture of dignity before an important visit, even in that unlikely setting at the back of the school, among garbage bags and worn cleaning equipment. Manny, overcoming the initial emotion, approached with the respect he reserved for the great trainers and mentors who had crossed his path. The social distance that would normally exist between an elderly janitor and a millionaire celebrity dissolved completely, replaced by a genuine reverence that would surprise any external observer. The boxer extended his hand, not as a formality, but as a gesture loaded with silent gratitude. Uncle Ernesto, after a moment of hesitation born of humility, shook that hand that had knocked down some of the greatest fighters in the world. The physical contact broke the initial tension, allowing the conversation to flow naturally. Walking slowly around the schoolyard, they shared fragments of their lives over the past decades. Manny listened attentively as Uncle Ernesto talked about his unchanging routine at the school, about the thousands of students he had seen grow up, about the small joys and daily challenges of his role. The janitor mentioned without self-pity the financial difficulties he had faced, the son he had lost to a disease that could have been treated with adequate resources, the wife who had passed away 5 years ago after a fulminant stroke. In turn, Manny shared less-known aspects of his journey. The doubts, the fears, the painful injuries hidden from cameras, the nights of solitude in luxurious hotel rooms in distant countries. He talked about the pressure of carrying the hopes of an entire nation on his shoulders, about the challenge of keeping his feet on the ground when the whole world seemed to want to elevate him to vertiginous heights. In a particularly moving moment, he confessed how many times, before important fights, he thought about the people from his childhood who demonstrated daily silent courage, and how Uncle Ernesto was among those unconscious inspirations. The sun began its descent on the Filipino horizon, painting the sky with orange tones that reflected in the puddles left by the cleaning of the yard. The conversation between the two men flowed with surprising naturalness, as if the apparent abyss between their lives was just a superficial illusion. There was a deep mutual understanding that transcended words, the recognition of shared values that remained intact, regardless of the drastically different paths they had followed. The dignified simplicity of Uncle Ernesto and the genuine humility of Manny created a bridge over the decades and circumstances that separated them. As the conversation progressed, Manny began to notice disturbing details about Uncle Ernesto's current situation. The janitor's worn uniform was not just the result of a day of hard work, but bore signs of prolonged use and repeated homemade repairs. His shoes, carefully cleaned but visibly worn, had partially unglued soles, kept together with improvised glue. When the elderly man gestured, Manny noticed dark spots on his wrists, marks of a recent medical treatment, perhaps from regular injections. With sensitivity cultivated through years of observing opponents in the ring, Manny also caught worrying physical signs. Uncle Ernesto's breathing occasionally became laborious during the walk, forcing him to pause subtly, disguising the discomfort with observations about the school facilities. His hands, still strong and skilled, presented an almost imperceptible tremor that he tried to control when holding objects. There was an underlying paleness to his brown skin that spoke of sleepless nights and inadequate nutrition. As they visited various areas of the school, they arrived at a small storage room at the back of the main building. Uncle Ernesto, with evident embarrassment, quickly mentioned that this was his space. Manny, initially confused, understood with a tightening heart that the small room of no more than 3 square meters, adapted with an improvised bed, a single burner stove, and a bucket for personal hygiene, was where the janitor lived. The concrete walls were decorated with newspaper clippings, many of them about Manny's victories over the years, yellowed by time but carefully preserved. Reality revealed itself in all its rawness. After more than 50 years of dedicated service to the school, Uncle Ernesto not only continued working far beyond retirement age, but also lived in precarious conditions, without the basic dignity he deserved in his final years. A careful conversation revealed that his small pension barely covered the medications for his diabetes and heart problems. With no close family and savings consumed by previous medical treatments, the elderly man had accepted the arrangement of continuing to work in exchange for a roof, basic food in the school cafeteria, and the possibility of maintaining his dignity through work. The contrast with Manny's own life could not be more striking. Mansions in various countries, robust bank accounts, access to the best hospitals in the world. The boxer felt a mixture of intense emotions: gratitude for the past, admiration for the elderly man's unwavering dignity, indignation at the present circumstances, and, above all, a growing determination that this situation could not continue. As he watched Uncle Ernesto meticulously organize his few possessions in the tiny space, Manny silently made a decision that would alter the course of the remaining years in the janitor's life. In the days following the encounter, Manny immersed himself in a discreet personal mission. Without media fanfare, without cameras or public announcements, he began mobilizing his trusted team to create a transformation in Uncle Ernesto's life. His first action was to schedule a complete consultation with an elite medical team in Manila, under the pretext of an old family friend who needed care. The janitor, initially reluctant to accept such generosity, was gently persuaded to allow his former student to give back a little of the much he had received in childhood. The test results confirmed Manny's suspicions: advanced diabetes, uncontrolled hypertension, early renal insufficiency, and a hernia that caused chronic pain ignored for years. The medical team, impressed with the resilience of the elderly man who continued working hard despite these conditions, established a comprehensive treatment plan. Manny personally ensured that all costs were covered and that medications reached Uncle Ernesto's hands punctually, through a discreet system that preserved the janitor's dignity. In parallel, Manny met with the school board, a conversation that quickly transformed into a historic event for the institution. The boxer announced his intention to establish an educational foundation that would benefit not only Cayamba Elementary, but also other public schools in the region. As part of this project, he proposed the creation of the Ernesto Maglalang Appreciation Program, a specific fund to ensure that dedicated employees could have a dignified retirement after decades of service. The initiative included retroactive benefits, starting with Uncle Ernesto himself as the first beneficiary. While the administrative aspects were being resolved, a construction team worked discreetly on a small house a few blocks from the school. The property, quickly acquired by Manny, underwent a careful renovation to become a comfortable but not ostentatious home, suitable for an elderly person's needs. Ergonomic furniture, adaptations for reduced mobility, a small garden for growing herbs. Every detail was designed to provide comfort without hurting the pride of someone accustomed to simplicity. On a quiet afternoon, Manny invited Uncle Ernesto for a walk around the neighborhood. They walked slowly, talking about the changes in the community over the decades, until they stopped in front of the newly renovated house. With genuine simplicity, Manny explained that this would be the janitor's new home, not as charity, but as fair recognition for his invaluable contribution to the education of generations of Filipinos. The keys were handed over without great ceremony, just with a sincere embrace that communicated what words could not adequately express. Uncle Ernesto's wrinkled face, normally controlled in its expressions, could not contain the silent tears that ran down his cheeks as he contemplated what for him represented a palace. 6 months had passed since the fortuitous encounter at the back of the school. Uncle Ernesto's life had transformed in ways he had never imagined possible in his 74 years of existence. His health, now properly cared for with regular medical monitoring, showed surprising improvements. The proper treatment for diabetes and hypertension had restored color to his cheeks and strength to his steps. The surgery to correct the hernia had eliminated the chronic pains he had silently endured for years, allowing him to move with a long-forgotten freedom. In his new home, Uncle Ernesto had developed a routine that balanced deserved rest with meaningful activity. The small garden in the back had become his personal refuge, where he cultivated vegetables and aromatic herbs that he proudly shared with neighbors. 3 times a week, by his own insistence and against Manny's initial advice, he still visited the school, no longer as a full-time janitor, but as a volunteer consultant who guided new staff and occasionally participated in classes as a storyteller, sharing with the children living memories of 5 decades of school history. The deepest transformation, however, was not material. It was the renewed sparkle in his eyes, the more upright posture of someone who could finally enjoy the respect he had always deserved. Uncle Ernesto had become an almost legendary figure in the community. The humble janitor who had inspired a world champion and now inspired new generations with his story of dignity and perseverance. The school children, who previously barely noticed his presence, now received him with admiration, eager to hear his stories about how the school was in the old days, and about the famous boxer who was once a student like them. Manny, in turn, had found in this renewed connection an emotional anchoring he had long sought. Amid the continuing pressures of his political and business career, his regular visits to Uncle Ernesto had become a living reminder of the fundamental values that defined his essence. In the quiet conversations on the porch of the small house, he found the simple but profound wisdom that no well-paid advisor could offer. The janitor, without realizing it, continued to be a teacher, now teaching lessons about aging with grace, accepting limitations, and the art of finding joy in simple things. The Ernesto Maglalang Appreciation Program had expanded beyond the original school, benefiting dozens of dedicated employees in educational institutions throughout the province. Without media fanfare, a precedent of recognition was being created for those often invisible workers who sustained the educational system with their daily effort. The model inspired similar initiatives in other regions, creating a systemic impact that transcended the individual case that had originated it. On a quiet December afternoon, while sharing a simple meal prepared by Uncle Ernesto himself with vegetables from his garden, the elderly man presented Manny with a package carefully wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a worn school notebook, preserved for decades, the last notebook that Manny had used in school before abandoning his studies. Uncle Ernesto revealed, with moving simplicity, that he had kept it all these years, first as a reminder of a promising student whom poverty had driven away from education, then as a memento of a young man from the community who was beginning to stand out in boxing, and finally as a precious relic of someone who had become a national icon. That notebook, with childish notes and awkward drawings, symbolized the deep connection between 2 men whose lives, seemingly so distinct, were actually complementary, each enriching the other's existence in ways that transcended material circumstances or public recognition. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.